Eleanor stood at the edge of Susan's backyard, watching the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the neatly trimmed grass. She held a glass of lemonade, the ice cubes clinking softly as she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. After 30 years of teaching literature at the university, retirement felt strange, like wearing someone else's shoes. "I can't believe you're actually back for good," Susan said, appearing beside her. "The neighborhood hasn't been the same without you." Eleanor smiled at her oldest friend. They had known each other since college, supporting each other through marriages, children, or in Eleanor's case, no children and divorces. Susan had stayed in their hometown while Eleanor's career had taken her to the city. "The city apartment was too quiet after I retired," Eleanor said. "I missed the trees." The afternoon garden party was Susan's way of welcoming Eleanor back. Old neighbors and a few new faces mingled around tables covered with blue checkered cloths. Eleanor had just turned 60 last month, and today, surrounded by familiar faces, she felt both her age and oddly young again. "Mom, where do you want these extra chairs?" The deep voice made Eleanor turn. A tall man with broad shoulders and dark hair touched with gray at the temples stood on the patio. He carried 2 folding chairs with ease, his sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned forearms. Susan waved him over. "James, come say hello to Eleanor. You remember her, don't you?" Eleanor felt her breath catch. This couldn't be little Jamie, the troubled teenager she had tutored in literature during her summer breaks. The boy who had struggled to focus, who doodled buildings in the margins of his notebooks instead of taking notes on Shakespeare. "Professor Williams," he said, setting down the chairs and extending his hand. His smile was warm, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "It's been what, 10 years?" "At least," Eleanor replied, taking his hand. It was warm and strong around hers. "And please, it's just Eleanor now. I'm not anyone's professor anymore." "Once a professor, always a professor," James said with a grin. "You saved my English grades, probably got me into college." Susan laughed. "He's an architect now, has his own firm downtown." Those building sketches finally paid off. It fell into easy conversation. James had divorced 3 years ago, no children. He had moved back to town to be closer to his mother after his father passed away. He asked about Eleanor's retirement, actually listening to her answers, not just being polite. "I'm working on restoring the old Miller Library," he mentioned. "You'd love what we're doing with the reading room." "The one with the stained glass ceiling?" "I spent half my childhood there." His eyes lit up. "We found original plans in the basement. The glass was designed to catch the afternoon light in specific patterns based on the seasons." Before Eleanor knew it, an hour had passed. They had moved from books to buildings to travel. James had been to Italy last year, visiting the same small towns outside Florence that Eleanor had loved during her sabbatical. "You should see his photos," Susan said, having returned from greeting new arrivals. "I'd like to," Eleanor replied, surprised to realize she truly meant it. As the evening continued, Eleanor found her gaze repeatedly drawn to James across the yard. Once he looked up and caught her watching. Instead of looking away, he smiled, raising his glass slightly in her direction. Eleanor felt a flutter in her chest, a sensation so long forgotten she almost didn't recognize it. She touched her cheek, feeling unexpected warmth there. "Ridiculous," she whispered to herself. But when James approached again before she left, asking if she'd like to see the library renovation sometime, she heard herself accept. Walking home in the summer twilight, Eleanor tried to dismiss the lightness in her step as simple happiness at being home again. But the image of James's smile kept returning, and with it a feeling she had no business entertaining at 60. A feeling like possibility. 3 days later, Eleanor found herself standing in front of her closet, trying to decide what to wear. She had agreed to meet James at the library at 10, and now she was second-guessing everything. She pulled out a blue blouse, then put it back, settling finally on a simple white shirt and gray pants. "It's not a date," she told her reflection in the mirror. "He's young enough to be your son." The old Miller Library stood in the center of town, its stone walls warm in the morning sun. Eleanor paused at the bottom of the steps, admiring the building she had loved since childhood. A figure appeared in the doorway. "You came," James called down, smiling. He wore a hard hat and held another in his hand. "I said I would," Eleanor replied, climbing the steps. "I've been curious about this place for weeks." Inside, the library smelled of dust and old books. Workers moved about, carrying tools and materials. James led Eleanor through the main hall, pointing out the original woodwork they had uncovered beneath layers of paint. "And here's the reading room," he said, pushing open a large wooden door. Eleanor stepped inside and looked up. The stained glass ceiling glowed with blue and green light. Workers on scaffolding were carefully cleaning each panel. "It's even more beautiful than I remembered," she said softly. James stood close beside her. "Wait until you see it when the sun hits directly overhead. The whole room turns gold." He handed her a hard hat, and they spent the next hour exploring the renovation. James explained his plans with passion, occasionally touching her arm to guide her attention to a particular detail. Each time, Eleanor felt a small shock of awareness. "What do you think about this?" he asked often, genuinely interested in her opinion. By the time they finished the tour, it was past noon. "Have lunch with me?" James asked. "There's a new cafe just down the street." Eleanor hesitated, but her hunger won out. The cafe was small and quiet, with only a few other customers. They sat at a corner table by the window. "So," James said after they had ordered, "how does it feel to be back?" "Strange," Eleanor admitted. "I keep expecting to wake up in my apartment in the city, late for class." "Do you miss teaching?" "Parts of it. The good students. The moments when someone suddenly understands something they've been struggling with." She smiled. "I don't miss the grading." James laughed. "I remember you used to write long comments on all my papers. You needed them." "I did," he agreed. "You were the only teacher who ever really pushed me." Their food arrived and conversation flowed easily. James told her about his divorce, how he and his ex-wife had simply grown apart. Eleanor shared stories from her teaching years, making him laugh with tales of student excuses. "You know," James said, leaning forward slightly, "I had a crush on you back then." Eleanor nearly choked on her water. "You were 17. 18, he corrected with a grin. "And you were the smartest woman I'd ever met." "Still are." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. "That was a long time ago." "Not so long." His eyes held hers across the table. After lunch, James walked her home. At her gate, he paused. "I'm hosting a small dinner at my place on Friday. Just a few friends. Would you like to come?" Eleanor knew she should say no. She thought of Susan, of the 22 years between them, of all the reasons this was a bad idea. But she found herself nodding. "I'd love to," she said. That night, Eleanor lay awake, staring at her ceiling. She told herself she was being foolish, that James was just being kind to an old family friend. But every time she remembered the way he looked at her across the table, her heart beat faster. "This is ridiculous," she whispered into the darkness, but she was already thinking about what she would wear on Friday. Eleanor arrived at James's house 15 minutes late on Friday evening. She had changed her outfit 3 times before settling on a dark green dress she hadn't worn in years. Now, standing on his porch, she almost turned to leave. What was she doing here? But before she could retreat, the door opened. "I was beginning to think you weren't coming," James said. He wore a simple button-down shirt and dark jeans. His smile made her stomach flip. "I got a little lost," Eleanor lied, stepping inside. James's home was smaller than she expected, but beautifully designed. Large windows looked out over a small garden. The furniture was simple and modern, with colorful artwork on the walls. "You have a lovely home," she said. "Thanks. Can I get you some wine?" Eleanor nodded, following him to the kitchen. "Where are your other guests?" James handed her a glass of red wine. There was a change of plans. Tom and Lisa had a babysitter cancel, and Mark got called into work. He looked slightly embarrassed. "It's just us tonight." "I hope that's okay." Eleanor took a large sip of wine, just the two of them. She should leave now. This was starting to feel too much like a date, but James was already showing her his collection of first edition books, and before she knew it, they were sitting on his couch, talking about their favorite authors. Dinner was delicious. Pasta James had made himself, with fresh bread and salad. Eleanor was impressed and told him so. "My ex-wife wasn't much of a cook," he explained, "so I learned out of self-defense." As they ate, Eleanor found herself relaxing. The wine helped, but it was more than that. James listened when she spoke. He asked questions about her life, her travels, her thoughts. No man had paid such close attention to her in years. After dinner, they moved back to the couch with fresh glasses of wine. James sat closer this time. "Tell me something," he said. "Why did you never remarry after your divorce?" Eleanor considered the question. "I was busy with my career, and after a while it seemed easier to be alone." "Were you lonely?" She looked down at her wine. "Sometimes. But I had my students, my research, my friends." "Like my mother," James said. The mention of Susan brought a flood of guilt. "Yes," Eleanor said quietly. "Like your mother." James seemed to sense her discomfort. He changed the subject, asking about her retirement plans, but the mood had shifted. Eleanor found herself checking the time. "I should go," she said eventually. "It's getting late." James walked her to the door. "I enjoyed tonight," he said. "So did I," Eleanor admitted. "Thank you for dinner." He stepped closer. "Eleanor." She knew it was coming and took a step back. "James, this isn't a good idea." "What isn't?" "This. Whatever this is." She gestured between them. "I'm 60 years old. I'm your mother's friend." "I don't care about that," James said. "Well, you should. And I should." Eleanor reached for the door. "Good night, James." The next morning, Eleanor called her sister Mary, who lived 2 towns over. They met for coffee at a small shop near the park. "You look troubled," Mary said after they had ordered. Eleanor sighed. "I'm having inappropriate feelings." "For whom?" "Susan's son, James." Mary's eyebrows shot up. "Little Jamie? The one who used to mow your lawn? He's 38 now, and an architect." Eleanor stirred her coffee. "It's ridiculous, I know." "Is it?" Mary asked. "He's a grown man. You're both single. He's 22 years younger than me, and Susan is my oldest friend." Mary reached across the table and took Eleanor's hand. "Ellie, when was the last time you felt something for someone?" Eleanor couldn't remember. "Years, certainly." "Life is short," Mary said. "Too short to ignore happiness when it comes along." When Eleanor got home, there was a message on her answering machine. James's voice filled her living room. "Eleanor, about last night. I can't stop thinking about you. Please call me back." She sat on her couch, staring at the machine for a long time. Finally, she picked up the phone and dialed his number. James answered on the second ring. "Eleanor?" His voice sounded hopeful. "Yes," she said, her heart beating fast. "I got your message. Can we talk? Not on the phone, in person." Eleanor closed her eyes. She thought of Mary's words about life being too short. "There's a small restaurant in Riverdale," she said. "About 20 minutes from here. No one from town goes there." "I know it," James said. 8 o'clock? 8 o'clock, she agreed. Eleanor spent the rest of the day in a state of nervous energy. She cleaned her house, sorted through old books, anything to keep her mind busy. At 6, she showered and dressed in black pants and a blue silk blouse. She put on a little makeup, something she rarely bothered with anymore. The drive to Riverdale took longer than she remembered. The restaurant was tucked away on a side street, warm light glowing from its windows. Eleanor parked and sat in her car for a few minutes, gathering her courage. She was about to have dinner with her friend's son. A man 22 years younger than her. What was she thinking? But James was already there, waiting at a corner table. He stood when he saw her, his face lighting up. "You came," he said as she sat down. "I said I would." A waiter brought menus and filled their water glasses. James ordered a bottle of wine. "I wasn't sure you'd call me back," he said once the waiter had left. "I wasn't sure I would either." Eleanor unfolded her napkin, avoiding his eyes. "James, what are we doing?" "Having dinner, I think." She looked up at him. "You know what I mean." James reached across the table and took her hand. His skin was warm against hers. "I like you, Eleanor. I enjoy spending time with you. That's all this needs to be right now." The waiter returned with their wine, and they ordered food. The tension eased as they ate and talked. James told her about a new project his firm was working on, a modern house built into a hillside. Eleanor shared stories from her years abroad during graduate school. "I always wanted to live in Italy," James said. "Why didn't you?" He shrugged. "Life got in the way. Marriage, career. My father got sick." "It's not too late," Eleanor said. "No," he agreed, looking at her intently. "It's not too late for a lot of things." After dinner, they walked along the small town's main street. The night was cool, stars visible in the clear sky. James's hand found hers and she didn't pull away. "What are you really afraid of?" he asked suddenly. Eleanor thought about it. What people will say, what Susan will think, the fact that in 10 years you'll still be young, and I'll be 70. Those are all what ifs, James said. What about right now? They had stopped walking and stood facing each other on the empty sidewalk. Eleanor looked up at him, at his kind eyes and the lines around his mouth that showed he smiled often. "Right now," she said softly, "I'm afraid of how much I want to kiss you." James stepped closer. "I'm not afraid of that at all." He bent down and his lips met hers. The kiss was gentle at first, almost hesitant. Then Eleanor's arms went around his neck and the kiss deepened. She felt like a young woman again, her heart racing, her body alive with sensation. When they finally broke apart, James rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he whispered. They drove separately back to town, but pulled over at a scenic overlook halfway home. The valley below was dotted with lights, the town small and distant. "Come here," James said, getting out of his car and walking to hers. Eleanor joined him at the railing. The night was quiet except for the sound of crickets and their own breathing. James put his arm around her waist, and she leaned into him. "Whatever happens," he said, "I want you to know that this isn't a whim for me. I've thought about you every day since that party." Eleanor turned in his arms. "I've thought about you too," she admitted, and then they were kissing again, more urgently this time, the taste of wine still on their lips. For the next 2 weeks, Eleanor and James met in secret. They drove to restaurants in nearby towns, went for walks in parks where no one would recognize them, and spent evenings at Eleanor's house with the curtains drawn. Each time they were together, Eleanor felt both happier and more guilty. "We should tell my mother," James said one evening as they sat on Eleanor's couch. His arm was around her shoulders, her head resting against him. Eleanor stiffened. "Not yet." "Why not? We're not doing anything wrong." "Susan might not see it that way." Eleanor pulled away slightly. "She's my oldest friend, James. I've known her since college. And I'm her son. She wants me to be happy." He took Eleanor's hand. "You make me happy." Eleanor wished it was that simple. But she knew people would talk. She knew they would judge her for being with a younger man, for betraying her friend's trust. Sometimes she judged herself. "Let's just keep this between us a little longer," she said. "Please." James agreed reluctantly, but Eleanor could see he was unhappy with the decision. She couldn't blame him. Sneaking around made their relationship feel shameful, as if they were doing something wrong. And maybe they were. On Saturday morning, Eleanor was making coffee when she heard a knock at her door. James wasn't supposed to come until that evening. She opened the door with a smile, which quickly faded when she saw Susan standing on her porch. "I brought muffins," Susan said, holding up a paper bag. "I thought we could have breakfast together." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "That sounds lovely," she managed to say, stepping aside to let Susan in. They sat at the kitchen table, and Eleanor poured coffee with shaking hands. Susan talked about her garden, about the town council meeting, about a new book club she had joined. Eleanor tried to listen, to respond normally, but her mind was racing. Had Susan found out? Did she suspect? "Are you feeling okay?" Susan asked suddenly. "You seem distracted." "Just tired," Eleanor lied. "I haven't been sleeping well." Susan reached across the table and touched her hand. "You'd tell me if something was wrong, wouldn't you? We've always been honest with each other." The guilt hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She opened her mouth, not sure what she was going to say, when the back door opened. "Eleanor, I used the spare key you." James stopped in the doorway, his face frozen in shock as he saw his mother sitting at the table. Susan looked from James to Eleanor and back again. "What are you doing here?" James was still holding the key in his hand. He was dressed casually, as if he'd been here many times before. There was no way to explain this away. "Mom," he began. "You have a key to her house?" Susan stood up, her coffee forgotten. "How long has this been going on?" "We were going to tell you," Eleanor said, standing as well. "We just." "Tell me what, exactly?" Susan's voice was dangerously calm. "That my oldest friend is sleeping with my son." "It's not like that," James said. "Then what is it like?" Susan looked at Eleanor, her eyes full of hurt and betrayal. "How could you, Ellie? Of all the men in the world, you had to choose my son." Eleanor felt tears forming. Susan, please, let's talk about this. There's nothing to talk about. Susan grabbed her purse. James, I suggest you think carefully about what you're doing. And Eleanor, she shook her head. I never thought you would betray me like this. She stormed out, letting the screen door slam behind her. James moved to follow, but Eleanor caught his arm. Let her go, she said. She needs time. James looked torn but stayed. They sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Finally, James spoke. I should have listened to you. We should have told her ourselves. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak past a lump in her throat. Everything she had feared had come true. She had lost her oldest friend, and for what? A relationship that couldn't possibly last. I should go, James said eventually. Eleanor didn't try to stop him. As the door closed behind him, she sat alone at her kitchen table, the muffins Susan had brought still in their bag, untouched. For 3 days, Eleanor heard nothing from James or Susan. She tried calling both of them, but neither answered. On the 4th day, she stopped trying. This was what she had feared all along, losing everything because she had been foolish enough to fall for a younger man, her friend's son, of all people. The town seemed to know what had happened. Eleanor felt eyes on her at the grocery store, heard whispers stop when she walked into the post office. She kept her head high, but inside she was crumbling. You need to get out of town for a while. Mary told her over the phone. Come stay with me. Eleanor considered it, but leaving felt like running away. Instead, she threw herself into fixing up her house. She painted the kitchen, reorganized her bookshelves, weeded the garden until her hands were raw. 2 weeks after Susan had discovered them, Eleanor was at the hardware store buying supplies to repair her fence when she ran into Tom, one of James's friends. Eleanor, he said, looking uncomfortable. How are you? I've been better, she admitted. Tom shifted his weight. Look, I don't know if I should say this, but James is miserable. He's not sleeping, barely eating. He misses you. Eleanor's heart ached. Has he talked to Susan? He's tried. She's not ready to listen. That night, Eleanor sat on her porch swing, watching the stars appear one by one. She thought about James, about the way he looked at her as if she was the most interesting person in the world, about how, for the first time in years, she had felt truly alive. Was she really going to give that up without a fight? The next morning, Eleanor made a decision. She packed a small suitcase, called Mary to tell her she was coming after all, and booked a ticket to Italy. She had always wanted to go back, and now seemed like the perfect time. 2 weeks in Florence, away from the gossip and the pain, might give her the clarity she needed. The trip was exactly what Eleanor needed. She wandered through museums and churches, ate meals at small cafes, and wrote in her journal for hours. She thought about James often, but with each passing day, the ache dulled slightly. This was what growing older had taught her. Pain faded, life went on. On her last day in Florence, Eleanor sat at a cafe overlooking the Arno River. The waiter had just brought her coffee when her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Susan. We need to talk when you get back. Eleanor's hands trembled as she replied, I'll be home tomorrow. When her plane landed, Eleanor was exhausted but strangely calm. Whatever happened with Susan, with James, she would survive it. She had spent 2 weeks remembering who she was, not just a woman who had fallen for a younger man, but a person with her own strength and dignity. She took a taxi from the airport, surprised when it pulled up in front of not her house, but Susan's. The driver insisted this was the address she had given him. Too tired to argue, Eleanor paid and got out, dragging her suitcase up the familiar path. Susan opened the door before she could knock. She looked tired, her eyes red-rimmed. You came, she said. You asked me to. Susan stepped back to let her in. The house smelled like coffee and the cinnamon rolls Susan always made on Sunday mornings. A wave of nostalgia hit Eleanor. How many mornings had they sat at that kitchen table, sharing coffee and conversations? I've been doing a lot of thinking, Susan said, leading her to the living room. About you and James. Eleanor braced herself. Susan, I'm so sorry. No, Susan interrupted. Let me finish. I was angry, hurt. But these past weeks, she took a deep breath. I've realized that life is too short to throw away 40 years of friendship. Eleanor felt tears welling up. I never meant to hurt you. I know. Susan reached out and took her hand. "And I know my son. He's stubborn, just like his father was. When he wants something, he doesn't give up easily." "What are you saying?" Susan's smile was sad but genuine. "I'm saying that I may not understand it, but I can try to accept it, for both your sakes." Eleanor stayed at Susan's house for 2 hours. They talked more openly than they had in years, with tears and laughter and long silences. By the time Eleanor left, something fragile had been repaired between them. Not the same as before, but something new, perhaps something stronger. "I told James you were coming back today," Susan said as she walked Eleanor to the door. "He wanted to be here, but I asked him to let us talk first." Eleanor nodded, grateful. "What did he say?" "That he'd wait for you at your house. He's been watering your plants, by the way." Susan smiled faintly. "He's never taken care of a plant in his life before." Eleanor took a taxi to her home, her heart beating faster as they approached. She saw James's car in her driveway. He was sitting on her porch steps, looking down at his phone. When he heard the taxi, he looked up, and his face broke into a smile that made her chest ache. James paid the driver before Eleanor could even reach for her wallet. He took her suitcase and followed her to the door, neither of them speaking until they were inside. "How was Italy?" he asked finally. "Beautiful. Exactly what I needed." Eleanor set her purse down on the counter. Her house was spotless, she noticed. Not just the plants watered, but everything cleaned and tidied. "You've been busy." "I needed something to do." James took a step toward her, then stopped, uncertain. "I missed you, Eleanor." "I missed you too." The words felt inadequate. "I talked to my mother, a lot. It wasn't easy at first, but we've reached an understanding." Eleanor nodded. "She told me." James ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture she'd come to recognize. "Where does that leave us?" Eleanor looked at this man standing in her kitchen, this man who had somehow broken through walls she'd spent years building. 22 years younger, yes, but also kind, intelligent, and looking at her as if she was the only woman in the world. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've spent 2 weeks thinking about us, about what this could be. I'm still scared, James." "Of what?" "That one day you'll wake up and regret choosing someone so much older. That people will never accept us. That I'm being selfish." James closed the distance between them and took her hands in his. "I don't care what people think. I care about you. About us. It won't be easy. The best things rarely are." Eleanor looked up into his eyes, searching for doubt, for hesitation. She found none. "Your mother says you're stubborn." "She's right," he said with a small smile. "Once I know what I want, I don't give up easily." "And what do you want, James?" "You." He said it simply, without drama. "Just you." Eleanor felt something inside her shift and settle. She had spent her life being practical, sensible. Maybe it was time to be brave instead. "I want you too," she said softly. The kiss that followed felt like coming home. When they broke apart, James rested his forehead against hers. "So what now?" "Now we take it one day at a time, slowly." 2 months later, Eleanor sat in a restaurant with Susan and James. It wasn't the first time the three of them had been together since her return from Italy, but it was the first time that felt almost normal. Susan still looked away sometimes when James took Eleanor's hand, but she was trying. "I've been offered a project in Boston," James said as they ate dessert. It would mean traveling there for a few days every month. "That's wonderful," Susan said. "Will you take it?" James looked at Eleanor. "I thought we might both go. Eleanor's never been to Boston." "I'd like that," Eleanor said, surprised. They hadn't traveled together yet. Susan's smile was small but genuine. "You should. The fall is beautiful there." As they left the restaurant, Susan pulled Eleanor aside while James went to get the car. "Are you happy?" she asked. Eleanor looked at her old friend, then at James walking toward them. "Yes," she said. "More than I thought possible at 60. Susan squeezed her hand. "Then I'm happy for you. Both of you." Eleanor watched as James held the car door open for his mother, then for her. As they drove through the town where she had spent so much of her life, Eleanor reflected on the strange path that had led her here. At 60, she had found something she hadn't known she was missing, something that made her feel both young and perfectly, contentedly her age. It wouldn't always be easy. There would be challenges, judgments, difficult days ahead. But looking at James beside her, At Susan in the back seat trying so hard to understand, Eleanor knew one thing with absolute certainty: it was worth it.